morning. Welcome to the second day of the International Roundtable Conference, Urban Refabricating Allies, Re-fabrication Urbanism 2022 by Urban Ally, Faculty of Architecture in Pakistan University. And you stay with me, Emerita, as your MC for today. Yesterday, we have a great sharing from our keynote speakers, Johan Widodo and Katerina Ortiz, and a lot of great presentation in Re-fabricating Urbanism, Make It Happen, which is happening right now. And today, we still continue our intensive program on the topic of sustainability and well-being, data thinking and data art. Starting with the lecture by our keynote speaker, which is Dr. Sharon Zukin. More about her background, she is a profession emerita from City University of New York, a lecturer, researcher, writer, and social activist who specialize in modern urban life. Her publications often explore urban change, market mechanism, and investment in space development. She has been held one of the most influential Neo-Marxist social thinkers. Many of her books questions about the emergence of new urban cultures through deindustrialization, gentrification, and immigration, which is critical to understanding of modern urban life. So Dr. Zukin will share more on refabricating the modern city, global narratives, and local demands. So after the lecture, we will have a Q&A session with Dr. Piriya Bunchayapruk will be our moderator. So it's an honor. If everyone ready, please welcome Dr. Sharon Zukin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm delighted to join you this morning. I wish I could join you in person, but through the miracle of modern technology, we can meet each other in this way around the world. Thanks to our colleagues at Urban Ally and Silpakorn University for organizing this very interesting gathering of people who are committed to understanding change in the city and trying to make it better. I have thought about refabricating or remaking the city for much of my writing and research career. A lot of the research that I have done in New York, but I have been lucky to travel to East Asia and Southeast Asia, as well as to Europe and Latin America, to try to understand what I see in my home city in a global perspective. And often the processes, even though there are great differences of economy, culture, and government, the processes are often the same. What does fabricating mean? Fabricating means making the physical city. The most important factors to make the city in a material sense are land, financial capital, and the cultures of each city and of cities in general. But in the eyes of local elected officials, the most important part of fabricating the physical city is to provide jobs to the people living in the city and the people who come to the city. The modern city, in this sense, the sense of stimulating jobs and stimulating more fabrication, is a growth machine, in the words of my sociological colleagues, Harvey Molich and John Logan. But the growth machine is not always welcome to people living in the city who represent the growth in very immediate ways. But the global discourse of growth in our time comes up with certain common words that become the inspiration for a global toolkit of policies in every large city. each policy is a strategy to remake the modern city for the 21st century. The first discourse that we had in the early 21st century was the discourse of the creative city. The idea was that city governments would not have to invest a lot of money, but with the small amount of money at their disposal, they could encourage the development of creative arts, both for market uses and imaginative, non-market expressive uses, so that graphic design and painting and sculpture, museum building, and artists' districts became part of the building blocks of every city around the world. Around the time of the 2008 financial crisis, which we in the United States call the Great Recession, when banks were close to failure and debts were not repaid, city governments realized that the creative city could not generate enough jobs and enough income for the city to survive. So a second discourse emerged, the discourse of the smart city. This would be a city where technology would be the most important industry. Creative people would work in technology industries to make the city prosperous, to make use of energy smart, and to help the city survive. This discourse soon developed into a discourse about innovation, where every city wanted to build innovation districts, bringing together government, business, and the nonprofit sector, primarily universities, to create the kinds of technological growth that could generate jobs, so that even real estate developers wanted to build buildings that would become the address of innovation. I'd like to take you on a trip with me around New York's innovation complex to see how old buildings were remade for the tech economy and how new buildings were created to fill in the spaces left in the city, to generate jobs for future growth. May we see the video, please?
Sharon Zukin. I want to show you New York's innovation complex. New York's wealth has always been rooted in its waterfront. In the old days, the wealth came from trade, docks and warehouses as the physical connectors between the city and the world economy. Today, a growing portion of the city's wealth comes from tech production for digital media, business software, and online shopping. Tech and creative offices are the new connectors to the global economy. They make up an innovation complex and also a new landscape of power. During the dot-com boom of the 1990s, new media companies clustered along Broadway from 23rd Street to Wall Street. The skyscraper canyon of Broadway got a new name, Silicon Alley. But this early tech economy suffered a series of nasty shocks: the dot-com stock crash in 2000-2001, the 9/11 World Trade Center attack, and the 2008 financial crisis. After the crisis, with new software and mobile technology, startups began to grow in New York's industries. These startups attracted venture capitalists and investment banks. And the New York City Economic Development Corporation staked out a strategy to make New York a technology center. Real estate developers were eager to fill office buildings that had been emptied by the 2008 financial crisis, as well as millions of square feet of new office development, starting with the World Trade Center. Companies benefited from subsidies to rebuild the district after 9/11. Media and tech firms like Condé Nast and Spotify moved into the new World Trade Center. Financial companies hired thousands of engineers to develop fintech. Wall Street is now a tech and media hub. Google has a big presence along the waterfront in Chelsea. They opened their first New York office in the early 2000s with one marketing employee. Now they have 7,000 people working in 5 buildings, starting with the old Nabisco Bakery building near the High Line. Think of it as a move from chocolate chips to silicon chips, although of course the chips are not manufactured here. This was a good moment for the area. In 2006, construction on the High Line had just begun, and a special zoning district connected its financing to real estate developers. Google now has 3 million square feet here, including YouTube production studios in the Chelsea Market building and offices in the old Port Authority headquarters. And they're expanding to a new campus west of Soho. In 2014, the northern end of the High Line opened, creating a pathway from Google to Hudson Yards. Most people know Hudson Yards for luxury housing, restaurants, and shopping, but it is also part of the innovation complex, where new corporate offices meld big tech and the city's biggest financial firms. BlackRock, JP Morgan, and Wells Fargo have offices here. So do Time Warner, HBO, Alphabet's Sidewalk Labs, and the German software company SAP. Facebook has leased more than 1 million square feet at Hudson Yards. And Amazon? Well, it's around the corner. On the East River waterfront, another important part of the ecosystem has developed. Cornell Tech, a partnership between Cornell University and Israel Institute of Technology, was initiated by the city government in 2010 after the financial crisis. It's a graduate school to train elite software engineers, app developers, and business students. The idea is that they will create startups in New York or get good jobs with the city's major tech employers and financial firms. Cornell Tech brings students and professors into collaborations with businesses. That's how the school, like the city's other universities, encourages innovation and entrepreneurship and capitalizes on faculty and student startups. Another short ferry ride away, the Brooklyn waterfront has gradually emerged as New York's new media and manufacturing district. Dot-com firms started out here in the 90s in Dumbo's old warehouses and factories. By the early 2000s, digital branding firms, media artists, and other startups formed a tech and creative hub. At the same time, the Brooklyn Navy Yard went through a transformation. In 2004, Steiner Studios for film and TV production opened there. This was the first large-scale production space to come along after the last shipbuilders moved out. Steiner Studios anchored the reimagining of the Navy Yard as a part of the city's new economy. In the 2010s, the Navy Yard signed with a real estate developer to create New Lab, an accelerator, incubator, and workspace for both hardware and software startups. The Navy Yard is one of the few places in the tech ecosystem that integrates manufacturing and tech offices, and a venture capitalist's office too. More than 100 startups work side by side at New Lab and connect to potential investors. Other startups are working with urban agriculture, transportation, and alternative energy. One company here designed this robotic coffee maker. Cool technology, but no baristas. The Brooklyn Navy Yard complex represents the best vision for now of what the ecosystem can become. Traditional manufacturing, new manufacturing, urban transportation, and urban farms. This is New York's new economy. Yet its future depends on continued real estate development, tech job growth, and city government support. Not an easy combination.
Okay, and now we're back to you.
Thank you. I hope that you can understand from this how the innovation complex fills in space in the city and takes both old buildings and new buildings for its own uses. Generating jobs, to be sure, as I mentioned earlier, but also bringing people who earn higher wages than many workers in the city, which creates a lot of pressure for the housing supply. Oops. I'll just show you where we went on that water journey. We started out this way, went through the financial district, past the World Trade Center. We did not stop at this big building, 1 million square feet, which you'll see a little later, that Google is building. We went here on the High Line to see the Google buildings there. And then we went up the High Line to Hudson Yards, which has become a center for corporate tech. Some of the big tech companies like Facebook and Amazon is not in Hudson Yards, but very close. The New York Times, Microsoft office. And then we went over to the East River to Cornell Tech, the postgraduate engineering and business school here. And then we went down the East River to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which is an old military installation that now is owned by the New York City government, where the old buildings are being refabricated for modern manufacturing. The global narrative that you can see in this innovation complex is that the city is building for growth. But what kind of growth and who benefits? One of the interesting contrasts we can see in New York is that it's easier to insist on public benefits coming from publicly owned land. It's much harder to get public benefits from privately owned land. The Brooklyn Navy Yard and the island where Cornell Tech is built are both owned by New York City. They're publicly owned. So that the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which is not only owned by the city, but it is managed by a nonprofit economic development corporation, which is not required to make a profit. That Brooklyn Navy Yard can do things for the local community and for manufacturers and for education that private developers and private employers will not do by themselves. Cornell Tech also is a university that embodies New York City's purpose to develop a group of entrepreneurial engineers who will continue to refabricate the city for growth. That's an elitist school. There are other places in the city where tech workers and engineers are trained, but this represents one part of the city's ambitions. Privately owned is a little more difficult to manage. Hudson Yards, which we saw, it is supposed to incorporate the most modern techniques of smart city growth and smart city garbage collection, and also smart city data collection. So it's not clear whom the smart city is going to be for if it's built on private land by private companies. Google is pretty much a good citizen in New York City, but the huge amount of office space that it takes up raises complicated questions about the influence that big technology companies will have in cities, including in New York. So that the global landscape of power that cities are building now owes a lot to companies like Google. This is the second Google campus that is being built in Manhattan. This is the second Google campus that's being built in London. How many campuses does a tech company need? And how much influence will those campuses and those companies have in the city? More visibly, in the past couple of years, we've seen local conflicts over who decides on refabricating the city and what kinds of benefits can they get. If the changes are tied to economic growth, the residents have a very difficult time to oppose them. For example, there is a proposal to build a tall office tower in the middle of a block on the Upper East Side of New York City. This is an area where rich people live, but they are residents nonetheless, and they don't want the tower. The tower land is owned by the New York Blood Center, which says that it does not have modern facilities to do the research on blood and blood plasma that need to be done to build New York's biotech complex. So even though the residents complained about a change in the zoning law to allow a real estate developer to build a tall tower in the middle of their street, the residents lost, and the rezoning was accepted because all of the city council members said, we need this tower to build the biotech part of the innovation complex. In Soho and the area to the north, NoHo, in Lower Manhattan, the city government proposed a rezoning to build for economic growth in a different way. First, they want to build offices and apartments for workers in Google and Disney just to the west of Soho. They also want to build residences that highly paid tech workers could live in and walk to work. Up to now, the area of Soho has been an artists district and a shopping district and a historic district, but all of those meanings of Soho are in question, as well as the oldest Chinatown in New York City. We have 3 Chinatowns now in New York City in different parts of the city. The oldest one is just east and south of Soho, and that the residents in that part of Chinatown are also threatened by this rezoning because it will enable new buildings and more expensive buildings to be built. Just so you have a look at where Soho is, on the map I showed you a few minutes ago, where we went to the tech places, Soho is right here. It's in the middle of Lower Manhattan. The historic Chinatown is over here. The area called Tribeca is over here at the World Trade Center, and the financial district, which is now largely a residential district, are over here. And a corporate tech district is here, and the tech offices of startups as well as venture capitalists goes up here to about here. Soho is an area that is of great interest to historic preservationists because of the cast iron facades of the 19th century buildings that remain in great number in Soho. But during the past 50 years, Soho has changed a great deal. Almost all of the land is privately owned, and the buildings are privately owned. There is very little publicly owned land. Back in the 1970s, zoning laws were changed to protect the remaining manufacturers who used loft buildings for their factories and warehouses, but they also allowed artists to live in lofts and work in lofts, which were understood to be artists' factories for the individual artists. And it was also understood that artists would tolerate living in these factories, although most people would not want to live in such places. At the same time, for slightly different reasons, the cast iron facades of these 19th century buildings attracted the interest of historic preservationists, and they pressed the city government to preserve the buildings and to create whole districts of these individual landmark buildings within Soho and the area to the north of it. There were also some laws that controlled the rents for artists living in a number of artist live work lofts. But over time, most of the lofts in Soho became owned by the people who lived in them. And sometimes the artists sold those lofts to people who were not artists. Often they were lawyers or bankers or tech entrepreneurs. As this happened, property values rose so that Soho became partly an artist district, but partly also an area of very expensive housing and very expensive boutiques. By 2015, the city just a few years ago, the city government decided that it was time to modernize the zoning laws. I think they wanted to refabricate the zoning laws to fit the refabricated part of the city that Soho represented. So how could Soho be modernized through zoning laws? The artists themselves, when they came in the 1970s, took the spaces that had been factory spaces, or in this case, a restaurant for factory workers who came from the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico to work in the factories. And they made their own restaurants. They made their own art galleries. And of course, they made their own studios in the lofts on the upper floors. By 2010, however, Soho looked quite different. The buildings, old buildings are still there. The cobblestone streets are still there, but the ground floors were used by boutiques by this point, and the lofts above were very expensive. So that the rezoning that was accepted by the city council last year allows real estate developers to build tall buildings, new tall buildings in a historic landmark district. The benefit for the public is that 30% of all the new apartments will have lower than luxury rents. The rents will not really be affordable to everyone in New York, but they will be affordable to more people than a small group of elites. However, the zoning laws create, the new zoning laws create what the geographer Neil Smith once called a rent gap. There will be such a difference between the amount of rent that people are paying now for lofts and also for apartments in Chinatown, and the higher rents that the new buildings will command, that there will be a pressure on developers and building owners to destroy their buildings and build new buildings to enjoy the higher rents. There will be a special permit required for very big stores, restaurants, and bars. This the residents of Soho want, but I think it will be easy for those big stores and restaurants and bars to get the permit because the city government wants to grow even further the retail business economy that Soho now embodies. Finally, there will be a requirement to change artist live-work lofts to residential use according to the buildings code, which will be very expensive for the artists to do. The local community board, which engages in a kind of self-government that we have in New York City, opposed these zoning changes, but the city government did not listen, and the city council accepted these zoning changes. There was a lot of criticism of the new zoning laws, and this is a caricature of our former mayor, who was mayor until January of this year, and you can see the same character in this cartoon that we saw in the mural on the wall of the building in the meatpacking district at the beginning of my presentation. If the city is building for growth, where are the public benefits? Where is the preservation of cultural heritage? Where is the survival of local communities? So I'm left looking at my own city with many questions that I want to leave you with too. Refabricating the city is shaped by markets, especially real estate markets, and by laws, zoning laws, historic preservation laws, rent laws. What is their effect? Do we know what will happen? Who should represent the common interest? Should the community have control over what happens in its locality? Or should there be a citywide plan that requires each community to accept the plans of the city government? Should the city be refabricated for existing communities or for a vision of future growth? What I am always asking is, can we make a city that creates conditions for both the social reproduction of local communities and local identities and a global narrative of economic growth? Here's where we see the living conflict between the local and the global. So I hope you have questions and comments, and I want to hear them.
Thank you very much, Professor Sharon. Thank you for your wonderful lecture. And of myself, who is your big fan, it is so meaningful for me to really appreciate and enjoy your talk so much. And your three strategic question is actually some kind of the question that I quite prepare a little bit. So I might beginning with my question while we're waiting for the question from the floors. I think in the capitalist world, the growth machine, which is, you mentioned, is needed to present the incline like development, and that leads into the so many changes. And of course, there are so many arguments about the change with the community. And also from my student in the class regarding the gentrification and clash between the new development and the community, they always ask my opinion, what is the solution for such the events. And I always answer that give the community some time to adapt and slow down the change by the regulation and laws. But I also would like to ask you, as I am your student, what is your opinion on the solution for the clash between the new development and the community, and also the big tech going into the community like that?
This is a very difficult question. First, we must say that we as experts or researchers, we cannot decide for other people. Everyone must, decide for themselves. But not only in capitalist economies, but in every economy now, we see a great pressure to build for growth, which depends on the largest companies. This building for growth depends on an idea of investment that will return profits to the investors, whether those investors are in government or they are in the private sector, they are in the financial world. There is a very close union between big companies in, let's say, technology and real estate companies and governments, whether they are city governments or national governments, but usually it's city governments that have the authority to say what can be built in particular places. In some countries, the city government invests directly in building technology complexes. Universities are also involved and implicated in these processes. Universities, for the most part, do not make a profit in money, but they profit by having a distinguished reputation for research, and they do commercialize the inventions of their science faculty, not their sociological faculty, but their science faculty. And so universities also usually want to collaborate with the city government because they want to have good relations. Yeah. So there is a kind of union between big business, local government, and universities, which local communities have a very hard time opposing. Mm-hmm. Even in situations where there are democratic forms of public meetings where the public can express their wishes and ask questions and make criticism, those public hearings do not have an effect on the decisions that are made. So, I think there has to be much more debate in every city about what should be done for the greatest public benefit.
Yeah, that's great. And I think the combination between the university, the big tech, and the community is the good way, because you talk about the academic way that can address the problem and then guide what I actually ideally doing to help the community and so on. I think that's a good way to start in each city, as you mentioned. Another question, the land gap, from the new is really a problem in the city, because the old and historic building always in the central of the city, which has a high price value. Do you have any example that the adaptive reuse of the historic building can win the land gap and escape from the demolition? I don't know, maybe.
Well,
yeah.
So far, the zoning law is too new to see what the results will be. In other parts of New York City, when there has been rezoning, there has been a lot of development. Sometimes, some buildings are not demolished. We don't know what an individual real estate developer will decide to do in each case because of the finances of the individual building. But there always is a lot of new construction, and we don't know if in the future the commission to protect landmarks in New York City will want to be more serious about protecting them. It depends on your point of view, but many people think that the Landmarks Preservation Commission in New York City has not been strong enough to protect the historic landmarks.
That's great. And another, I'm not sure if it's not a question, but I think you can reflect on that a little bit. One of the question from the floor say that your talk remind me of the Jane Jacobs in the 1960s. Do you have any reflection? I think it's still the process that's going on in the New York, on and on and on. And I don't know, do you have any reflection on this phrase?
Well, there is a lot of similarity between my criticisms and Jane Jacobs' critiques. And I am honored to be compared to her. But in her time, she criticized the government, the city government, and the state government for demolishing buildings. Now it's more real estate developers who make the decisions, but the city government allows them to refabricate the way they want to refabricate. It's an interesting question to look at Soho as an example of Jane Jacobs' process of unslumming. She had the idea that it would be very good if government did not get involved in trying to fix neighborhoods and renovate neighborhoods. She thought it would be better for the people themselves to collect their money, to save their money, and to renovate their houses to make them better, and then they could stay in their houses. But she did not foresee that unslumming in Soho, or a kind of unslumming in Soho, would become so successful that the artists themselves would no longer live there. In other words, unslumming can become so successful that the community of people disappears and is replaced by a luxury community.
Oh, yeah, that's quite familiar with the situation in Bangkok nowadays as well. I think that's a good point to start with, because
I'm sorry, I was just going to say that this goes back to your first question. Perhaps there are some laws that could be made that would protect the rights of people to stay in place. I think that must be a very strong motivation for local governments.
Yeah, we still don't have that kind of regulation to protect the right to be in your place. It's still in like capitalist world that if the price pay enough, so people have to move.
Yes.
Something like that, and no protection at all from the government. And so many questions I have to just like get through.
Oh, great.
One of the questions said that I can see in Thailand, especially in Bangkok, that the business sector seems to dominantly drive the change in urban area. This is also the result of the political inequality in the society. Can you address this issue and suggest what the role of the urban planning or designers should take in the educational context or in the practices to help reduce this imbalance problem?
Well, this is a good question because urban designers and urban planners do not determine rents.
Yes.
You know, they don't make the laws. They work for other people. I mean, they work for real estate developers or for local governments. You know, that's the market for that kind of profession. So this is a very difficult question. You know, perhaps urban designers and urban planners must think of themselves as activists and advocates, not only artists and engineers, but advocates for communities. You know, there is such a thing as community planning. However, in New York City, the community plans are not listened to, I'm sorry to say, but there are planners who work with communities to express what they want to build or to have built where they live. The question is, number one, who will pay the urban planners and urban designers to do this work? Local communities do not have the resources to hire them. That would be something that a city government would have to pay for. Number two, would the city government really listen to what the community says?
Yes.
So again, you know, that even when we have locally elected members of the city council who must represent the interests of the district where they are elected, those people do not always represent the interests of the residents. They may represent the interests of some residents, or they may say they represent the interests of the residents, but the residents don't think they are representing them. But those people are democratically elected, right? If they have opponents, the opponents debate with them and they're not elected. So for urban planners and urban designers, I think it would be wonderful if they saw themselves as advocates.
Yeah, I think that's really the good answer and reply on this that kind of the situation and question, because I think the attitude is very important. Like when you try to as the professor who teach urban design, I try a lot to give them the attitude that you have to think about the public interest, like rather than like get rid of them and make the work easier to like get rid of the community and then you design something beautifully. I think that's the attitude that have to collect in the society and also in the view of the city government that have to see the value of the urban designer who is try to develop the city in the better way. I think that's the good one. And another question talk about I like how you frame the publicly owned land and the privately owned land in the innovation complex. I wonder what is the percentage of the publicly owned land and has somewhat turned its back on the public interest, and were there any controversy on that? How many percentage of the publicly owned land in the complex?
Well, first of all, I should say there always is controversy. I mean, and maybe even more controversy now because people are so aware of inequality and the way inequality is visible in cities, especially in New York. So I think people and people have heard the city government promise things that growth will bring, benefits to all, and there have been very, very great benefits, but they don't see that the benefits are as great as the need for good housing, good education, clean streets. The pandemic, of course, is making everything worse now, and that also makes people more angry and more contentious, more willing to challenge the city government. But particularly for land use questions, there is a lot of opposition and argument and even lawsuits now, where communities or community organizations sue the city of New York in court because they say that a zoning process was not correctly done. In fact, this very complicated situation of Soho's rezoning has led to a lawsuit. Just a few days ago, a group of residents have filed in court a lawsuit against the city of New York because they say the city did not make a serious consideration of all of the factors that would come from the rezoning. So we don't know what will happen there, but I have seen there are a lot of lawsuits now in New York City where community groups and community residents say the city is not acting legally, even though the letter of the law is respected, but the spirit of the law is not respected. The percentage of publicly owned land, I don't know. I don't know what it is in New York City. I know what it is in some other cities where 100% of the land is publicly owned or 50% of the land is publicly owned. I'm sure that it's less than 50% in New York City, a lot less than 50%. But what is interesting about the two places that I showed in the video, which are publicly owned land, the Brooklyn Navy Yard and Cornell Tech, is that they are mini districts. It's not just one piece of land here and another piece of land there. They are whole districts, so that Cornell Tech is built on an island in the middle of the East River. New York City owns that island, the entire island. Brooklyn Navy Yard is 300 acres. That's a very big site in New York City. It's not a big site in a Chinese city, perhaps, but it's a very big site in New York City. And it is all in one piece on the waterfront. So that it's in a way, in a material sense, it's easier to try to get public benefits in that situation where the geography allows a scale of building that might satisfy the private and nonprofit owners of the land or institutions that lease the land and the public interests.
Wow, that's so great for like the insight that you give, like the and talk about the waterfront again. Sorry, you said that the waterfront is the public publicly owned or the private?
Well, wait. No. Let me go back to that map for 1 minute. If I'll just go back to that map if I can. Let's see now. Well, let me see what I can do. Oops.
It's okay. It's
Now I've completely gone away from that. Let's see. Okay, let me go up to the map here. Okay. So there is, on the very edge of the waterfront here, this is a very narrow parkland owned by New York City. This is the island that's publicly owned. Almost all of this is this is actually owned by New York State, and that's also a park. It's a narrow park. Over here, all of this is privately owned, and there are a lot of individual owners. The building owners and real estate developers own all of this land. This is the Navy Yard, which is owned by the city, but all of this again is privately owned. And it's privately owned land until you go around 2 miles to the south down here, and then you also have two or three old industrial complexes, old warehouses really, that are owned by the city again. So most of the land on the waterfront is privately owned.
Wow. I think this is interesting because we have some kind of a problem with the waterfront, and that the government tried to make it as a public interest by reclaiming the water surface as the walkway, and a lot of people opposing that because you kind of destroy the environmental quality, but in New York, if you have like the publicly owned land in the water near the waterfront and so on, I think, and then you can make it as a public benefit as a park and everything. And when you talk about this kind of two differences condition, but you want the same, like the same result. Yeah.
I'm laughing a little. I'm laughing sadly because there are lawsuits about this too. For example, here, around here, for environmental protection against flooding, the city developed a plan in consultation with the communities who live here to create a park. And they created this park, and the communities began to use the park, and it was very nice, and a lot of people liked it. But then the city government decided, on the basis of a new engineering report that they did not share with the residents, that they needed to destroy the park after they had built the park, and maybe after, and they would put a lot of earth there to make a high berm to protect a high piece of land. The land would be raised so that the waters would not flood in here. But that means that the community would no longer be able to use the park. And so there is a lot of disagreement in the community between different groups of people in the community. Some of them say, okay, take back the park, make this environmentally sustainable land. But other people say, no, we want the park, we don't want the city to do this. And that also has led to a lawsuit against the city. So there we have a situation of two kinds of public benefits: environmental sustainability and green space. And the city government apparently did not act in a serious collaboration with the community.
Yes,
and
that's
this is
the problem.
There's a similar situation with publicly owned land, but just one piece of land, not the waterfront, but that one piece of land that involves a community garden that people established, and they want to keep the green space, but the city government has decided to take away the garden's lease and to give the lease to a real estate developer to build affordable housing. So there's a need for housing, which is a public benefit, but there's also a need for green space. So that also has led to, I'm sorry to say, that also has led to a lawsuit. So it's not easy at all. I mean, at least in New York, it's never easy. In some cities, it's much easier for the city to take the waterfront land. I'm thinking of Shanghai here in particular, to take the waterfront land, which is publicly owned, and to design it the way they want to design it, and say, here we are giving it as a gift to the public for you to use. It's true that the waterfront in Shanghai is much better now than it was before. There are walkways and there is recreational space and so on, but the people themselves did not decide. So there are always conflicts now over who should design the land, who should decide what should be built, and how can anybody balance different kinds of public goods?
Yeah, I think that's the question for the whole city as well, like who decide it, like, and where it should be something or not. I think that's the way that we should try to find a mechanism on that kind of the question and so on. Another question about the New York. New York is such a special city. However, from a sociological point of view, could you offer some examples of industry that might benefit the city resident socially and economically?
Oh,
we mentioned.
Well, one of the great things about the Brooklyn Navy Yard is that most of the space is industrial space. And there are those other publicly owned old industrial sites that are owned by the city that are being modernized now. So the industries that use that kind of space now are computer-aided design, all kinds of computer-aided manufacturing, artisanal, small-scale metalworking, woodworking, furniture building. During the first months of the COVID-19 pandemic, that those industrial spaces at the Brooklyn Navy Yard were immediately transformed to produce things for people in the pandemic. On the one hand, they produced uniforms and masks, right? They weren't necessarily clothing factories, but they were quickly converted from one kind of factory space to another kind of factory space to build protective equipment, the personal protective equipment that healthcare workers needed, and masks also. There is at the Brooklyn Navy Yard a distillery. That means they make alcohol to drink. And that distillery converted its manufacturing process to make sanitizer to wash hands during the pandemic. And then a collaboration was created between one or two businesses at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, a professor at MIT, and another business somewhere else. They built ventilators at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which the hospitals really needed for patients who had COVID. So I am a great supporter of manufacturing of those kinds in particular. Yeah. Also, we have a growing movie and television production industry. Mm. And there are facilities, studios, production studios, and also schools to train people to work in film and TV production at the Brooklyn Navy Yard and at the Bush Terminal, which is one of the city-owned industrial complexes in Brooklyn. Mm. I think there still are some clothing factories, not very many, but there still are some clothing factories, and that's an industry that belongs in cities. There are, small food producers, bakeries, for example, wholesale distributors of smoked fish, small companies that make sauces and spices of different kinds. The ingredients are not grown in New York City, but a lot of the processing industries that existed here in the past, that exist in other cities too, could survive if they are given support.
Yeah, I think, that's so interesting that you mentioned about the small production in the city. Still live in the city, not the big campus of the industrial, but like the small production and the industrial site, and the mix of them in one district that like help each other and then try to adapt their products in different time and different conditions. Yeah. That's very, very interesting, and it helps for the city to survive in this kind of the situation.
Yes, you think there are three kinds of sustainability, at least social sustainability. That's what we mean when we talk about the survival of local communities. And then there is economic sustainability, to the ability to produce some things that the city residents need. And then the third, of course, is environmental sustainability.
Yeah, that's great summary of that. I have one last question for you before we close the session. As you mentioned, global discourses lead to so many buzzwords for the job creation and new development, the smart, the creative, and the innovative city. What is the next buzzword that you think is going to be for the city development?
I don't know how to predict the future. We still see the innovation discourse very big, and that is extended to cover some of the industries that are just developing now, like biotech, is especially in the conditions of pandemic. All of the healthcare and biotech, and also property tech, everything connected with those fields are going to grow. I deeply hope that we do not have a big discourse of the crypto city, because so far I do not see that is a secure way to the future.
I agree. I cannot cope with that as well. I think it's too much for me. Thank you very much, Professor Sharon. I think we have really good session and good discussion, and I hope one day we can meet like face to face for the conference or the lecture or anything, and just like welcome you in Bangkok for the hotter weather. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.